This was a textual animation that has just been published. It's a draft, and it was published especially for the Mother Language Day that happened 2 days ago, the 21st of February, sorry, which is when Bangladeshi people were killed, when Pakistan did not allow Bangladeshi people to speak their language. This is why the International Mother Language Day is on that day. I would like to ask Stephen Atkinson, who is a Bangla man, not Bangla from Bangladesh, but Bangla, to just introduce the Bangla language revival in a minute, because it's we only have 9 minutes together, and then I will continue from there. Thank you, Stephen.
I mean, we've started just over 4 years ago now, when Gillard came to the Bangla Board of Directors for our native title and asked whether we would like to try and reclaim our language. And of course there was a resounding yes. You know, we wanted to try and relearn and re-speak our language. We've found it's not an easy challenge. But it has opened many doors and brought great opportunities for our people and for our families. My mother was one of those who lost her language through the mission system, and sorry, it always makes me emotional talking about it, because she was forced not to speak her language. But through this language reclamation, not only has Mum somewhere, you know, she was taken an 8-year-old and put in a mission, she's somewhere in the back of her head started pulling out words that she was using as a child. And to me, that was amazing. You know, we're driving along and Mum's just going, oh, you know, I remember when we used to go down and see my grandfather's brother, you know, down in Iskungu. And I said, hey, what's that word? I never heard you say that before, Mum. She said, oh, I don't even know where it come from. And I just happened to have a Bangla dictionary there, so I just flicked through it. Hey, Mum, how you knew that word, that Bangla word, eh? So she knew the word for camp, or, you know, for his hut. And it just was in the back of her head. And she's done that a few times now. So, you know, just starting to reclaim language brings back memories, and it sort of sparks something in the back of the mind that, you know, we haven't tapped into for a long time. So, you know, that's done great things for my mother, and I'm mindful I don't want to take up too much time, because otherwise I might cut Gillard out. You just want to hear more about him, I'm sure. But, but you know, just from that, from wanting to start reclaiming our language, we've sort of come leaps and bounds. We've digitised our dictionary. We've now got a language app, and we've got people down in Port Lincoln writing kids' books. I've actually been able to get an article published in the Australian, which I've actually sent out to every newspaper, I reckon, in the country, and no one wanted to print it. And then Gillard sent an email out, and all of a sudden I'm getting phone calls saying, oh, we want to put your article out there. So, you know, it's always great to have a world-renowned linguist helping you, because there's great benefits to be had there. But, you know, it's really strengthened the people, and you know, this whole convention is about the government putting, you know, setting aside money for Aboriginal languages to be learnt in schools. And we're going a little bit further, I reckon, with the study that's happening because of our language reclamation with SAMRI and through NHMRC, and yeah, funded it. So South Australian Medical Health and Research Institute are now doing a study into the mental health benefits and the social and emotional wellbeing benefits of reclaiming language. So hopefully through this study we can, in the future, have the data and everything there to say that Aboriginal languages have to be taught in schools across the country, because it helps not only Aboriginal children but everyone. You know, there's a benefit there for everyone that can break down racism and break down barriers that we've, as Aboriginal people, all know we've had our back up against the wall and had to smash our heads into these barriers for a long time. But I'll leave it at that, and I'll leave the rest to Gillard. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen Atkinson. And I would like just to end our brief presentation by saying that we believe that part of the funding that is given for Aboriginal revival, a part of it, I don't want to say how much, should go towards what I would define as a strategic funding. And this is in order to prove that language revival is good for example, for health. In other words, we need to use part of the funding in order to secure future funding in 5 years, in 10 years, etc. So it's nice to have a 10 million, kind of one-off, but I think that we need to show again and again in the future. For example, another possibility is native tongue title, and this is when you define that Aboriginal people ought to receive compensation for the loss of language, not only for the loss of land, which is a very, in a way, revolutionary way of looking at things, because as we heard this morning, intellectual property, or this afternoon, it's kind of soft, it's intangible. But if we, for example, define Aboriginal languages as the official languages of the region, that means that in the future it will be easier to have such one-off $10 million. So I think that this is my own contribution. We should think about the future, how to ensure that the government, which is very generous, will continue to be generous, not just what to do with this 10 and that's it. We need to think about the 20-year horizon.
It's the language is just one part of a process where we've got to deconstruct the colonisation process, yeah? And the three things that colonisers did. The first thing they did, they took away our identity. Second thing they did, they took away our right to speak our language, practice our culture, conduct ceremony. And the third thing they did was they taught our history through Western curriculum. And that's why a lot of non-Aboriginal people are oblivious to the truth of history. And it's blatantly obvious why a lot of Aboriginal people are now struggling. So it was the instruments of government that created the problem. It's now the instruments of government that now need to rectify the problem. And the term Aborigine, as an example, was a pseudo-scientific Latinised term introduced to define all of us as one, and that's clearly not the case. We're extremely diverse. What I'd like to do is give you all the opportunity to just talk generally about the subject area, and seeing that Gillard has taken over the show straight up. But thank you, Stephen, for your deadly presentation. How does that make you feel personally?
It does give a great sense of pride, not only to me, but I think to all Bangla people, reclaiming our language. I suppose it starts to give you an insight and an understanding when you're looking at place names and different things in your country, what your ancestors named, and it sort of gets into their mindset. You go, oh, wow, that's why they call that. You know, I can sit up on top of that Emu Bottom Hill, they call it down in Lincoln, and know the name of it in language, and you can sit there and look at that you're standing on the emu bottom. You can see it. You can see the whole emu when you're standing up there, you know, and you know why they called it that. There's different things, and it sort of gets into their mindset. You can understand their way of thinking. So it not only just connects you with your country, it connects you with your language, it connects you with your ancestors and those who have gone before you. And I think that's how, you know, for myself, how it makes me feel.
Yeah, no, steadily. We carry in our heart the true country, and that cannot be stolen. We follow in the steps of our ancestry, and that cannot be broken. Exactly. And the extension of that conversation, what you're reacquiring now, is going to be taught from here and here to future generations, and that's the beauty of this process. Doug, would you like to start the conversation? Just to get your experiences and perspectives on language revival across the situation. Well, spoken language is strong and experiencing reinvigoration. Elders speak language, however, wider community knowledge is still developing. Language is being reclaimed after not being spoken for long periods of time. So we just want your experiences and your advice.
Thanks very much. So just to take you back to this morning, you might recall Craig Ritchie mentioned that in language revival, context is all important, it's crucial. And there are some broad aspects of the context, some broad contexts that we can look at to start getting a guide. And because we don't have much time, I'm just going to try and use that to make a single point. to start. My first point of two. So essentially, you can take all the languages, Indigenous languages of Australia, and say that we can put them into two contexts. There are those that are being passed on to children as a matter of course. So sometimes they're called strong languages. I think that's a misnomer because they are still highly endangered. I hear people say sometimes that they're all right up there in the Northern Territory or WA or wherever. They have their language, it's all good. But if you look at the NILC surveys, in 2004, it was found that there are close to 20 languages that were still being passed on to children as a matter of course, so the strong languages. The 2014 NILS, National Indigenous Languages Survey, found that there were around a dozen being passed on. Now, I'm sure of those dozen, some are very strong, I'm told, are very strong and will last for a long time, but others are are in some decline because of the various pressures put on languages by broad society. So what worries me is that we're going to see, potentially, if this decline continues, one day we'll see in Australia where there are no languages being passed on to children as a matter of course. None of those languages that have an unbroken line of tradition will continue in that way. Now, I personally don't want, and I think this is aesthetics and ethics, Gillard, I don't want there to be in Australia where there are no remaining unbroken lines of transmission of language. And I actually think that it's gone far enough. So we're down to a dozen that are in that situation. So I'm not talking about the others, just these ones. And I think we should lose no more, and we need some kind of national commitment to have no more of those be lost. Once the transmission goes, the transmission to children, then the speakers get older and a language joins the other big group of languages, 100 or so, which have speakers, often just a few elderly speakers, but it's not being passed on. And then you're into the language revival work, which is very difficult work, and all credit to those who do that and do it very successfully in many cases, but it's extremely difficult work. And if the languages can simply not be lost, or those that remain can not be lost in the first place, I think that's a better solution, an easier solution. So that's my point there, that we should simply refuse to allow any more of the languages that are being passed on to cease to be passed on. Now, I'll just move on to quite a different issue, which is a complaint that I often hear, which I think is quite valid. So people often say to me, we want to work on our language. A linguist wrote a grammar, we got the grammar, and we can't read it. We can't make heads or tails of it. This is a common thing that's said, and I hope that everyone understands that when you analyse a language, they're incredibly complicated things. So in writing a description of such a complicated thing, you have to use specialised jargon, and so it's a very technical document. But there's no reason why that kind of work, grammar writing, should stop there. And the next step, which some people have taken, and we saw the Murabai example earlier today, is to move on to creating learners' grammars. And I think we need now to have we had a long period of time in Australia's history in the 70s, 80s, 90s and so on, when there was a lot of language grammar writing and documentation. But I think now for every grammar there should now be someone working on a learner's grammar, which takes that information and makes it accessible and available to educators, to learners, to community members, to everyone who wants to use it to learn the language. And then that's the document that can be used to provide the material for all the other kinds of primary school language learning materials, adult courses, online courses, apps, whatever, digital materials, anything. That's where the content comes from. So I think all linguists certainly should be aiming that if you've written a grammar, why not go on to the next step, work with community members and educators and produce a good learner's grammar. So you need a much bigger body of those. So look, they're the 2 points I wanted to make. But I'll go on to into a bit more detail, which is that I think there's a lot of people here who get their funding from government funding bodies, and you have KPIs, key performance indicators. I think that's what it stands for. You have to measure up to those to get your funding. Well, I think it's time to turn that around and say we need to have some KPIs for the Australian government in this area. There needs to be a KPI that the decline in the number of languages being transmitted to children as a matter of course, that has to stop. We can't lose any more of those. There's been enough loss. It's been terrible enough. We just can't have that continue. You know, how many limbs can you lose from a body? And I think they're part of the Australian body. So that's one KPI. The other one is that every language should have a dictionary and a learner's grammar. And these don't give you your language back, but they're the kind of materials that feed into all this digital work we're hearing about, and feeds into all the other activities and makes that much more doable to have a dictionary and a learner's grammar. So there you go. A couple of KPIs for the Australian government. Thanks, everyone.
So that would probably be the next steps you'd suggest, yeah? I use the example, was it today, yesterday or today? I don't know, man, I'm getting weary now, but the issue of legislation was raised, national legislation, and I use New South Wales as an example. New South Wales government is doing some pretty amazing things in terms of language. It's got legislation in that space. They've done the same with healing, and it might be something that will influence other state, territory governments, but ultimately the federal government should probably do something. Yeah.
I think so. I think that's something that will. Thanks. I think you're right. I think that's something that will happen, and I do hear talk that people are thinking about these kind of things more widely. So New South Wales has taken the lead, and I can't say I'm very familiar with the legislation. Is everyone in New South Wales happy with it?
I think
yes.
it's early stages, eh?
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's probably a good experiment, and the rest of us can watch and see what happens. And if it's turned out to be good, then that kind of thing could well be implemented elsewhere. I certainly hope so. But at a national level would be good as well. It would be ideal if there was complementary legislation to support the state legislation. Each state being different, they'll need different kinds of legislation and having different histories. But I think you're right.
Yep. Anthony and Trace, what was your take on that, New South Wales? Is it happening or what?
Legislation is still reliant on the work that's happening in the community space. It doesn't replace the work that's happening in communities, and the legislation should empower and strengthen communities. It should be designed around strengthening community decision making, empowering communities to take control of their languages and their language revival. And it also should be the New South Wales legislation has three parts. There's acknowledgement of languages. There's the creation of a trust, which is responsible for the decision making around Aboriginal languages. So it's no longer bureaucrats in government agencies. It's an Aboriginal board that's making those decisions. And it has a strategic plan, so that there's a 5-year commitment around resources and around actions to revive Aboriginal languages. So it's not just a year-on-year thing, it's something that has long-term focuses and long-term goals.
Yep. You can't win Origin, but you've set a precedent for other governments across the country to try and think about, yeah? Okay. Lesley, speak from the heart, you'll always be fluent.
Okay. I'm talking, pretty much similar to what Doug was saying, but probably from a different perspective. So I'm thinking about linguistic research, and I want to kind of raise some questions about how we could refocus linguistic research to stop our languages dying. So I've called it, or coined it, linguistic research in action. So when we're looking into the future of Indigenous languages in Australia, what do we see? We're being told that Indigenous languages will no longer be spoken throughout Australia within 50 years, and that might be sooner rather than that long or so. And these languages must be documented and saved for prosperity, so that we'll have languages, so that we will know what these languages once looked like, and future generations of Indigenous people can reclaim these languages and revive them into the future. To me, as an Indigenous person who's working with archival records to try and revive my own language, like so many others in Australia, this model is flawed and not sustainable. We now need to be thinking about what it is we are going to do to stop our languages going to sleep. In the language maintenance context, from an Indigenous perspective, the big question is, how do we keep our languages alive? And this question should be forefront in the minds of linguists, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So the majority of languages that are still being spoken are critically endangered, as Doug said, many with just a handful of adults who speak their mother tongue fluently. From an Indigenous point of view, there needs to be a shift in focus of linguistic research towards actively creating new generations of speakers for all Indigenous languages. This must include a better balance between funding for academic research and empowering Indigenous communities to actively foster and create the next generations of speakers. Oral language learning programs such as Master Apprentice and Language Nests can work hand in hand with language documentation and other linguistic research in a way that everyone's needs are being met, and are critical to keeping our first languages alive. Language documentation and other linguistic research alone cannot save a language and is only a part of the answer. Many Indigenous communities in Australia and around the world have been involved in language documentation over many decades, and this has often resulted in valuable language resources, generally producing a descriptive grammar and possibly a dictionary of the language. Linguists typically use the data collected to add to the global scientific understanding of linguistic typologies, and Indigenous communities often use these resources, the resources produced later on for language maintenance, revitalisation or reclamation programs, often after the last speakers have died. However, many Indigenous people say that formal linguistic treatment of a language is irrelevant or low priority to oral traditions of a living language. Indigenous communities in Canada argue that a language is not saved by being documented and that it is saved when a language is being used and transmitted orally. Prominent American linguist Leanne Hinton points out that community members say they would rather have their languages on their tongues than in a dictionary, and we are beginning to hear this message echoed across Australia also. As I said, many Indigenous communities in Australia have been involved in language documentation projects for many years, are also beginning to question if documentation alone will save their languages. Some Indigenous communities are beginning to change their focus to oral language maintenance activities in an effort to reverse the alarming rapid decline in the numbers of people speaking languages, despite the fact that Indigenous have often been working in these communities for many years. Why is there seemingly a separate agenda here, or more importantly, what drives the research agenda of linguists? The answer, I believe, can be understood from the point of view of the academy and the very narrow ideas about what constitutes scientific research. And these ideas are shared by the major funding organisations who support universities and fund research. Is it possible that the question, how do we keep our languages alive, becomes a major area of inquiry in linguistics? Can we imagine a Master Apprentice program or a Language Nest program as a research site for the collection of language data or collecting other types of linguistic data? There urgently needs to be a shift in focus of linguistic research towards actively creating new generations of speakers. This must include a better balance between the funding in linguistic research and working in genuinely collaborative partnerships with Indigenous speaker communities in ways that will positively discriminate to help create new generations of speakers. This necessarily implies a rethink about the way major research funding organisations, including the Australian Research Council, among others, view language maintenance and revitalisation activities, squarely facing the fact that Indigenous languages are the industry base of linguists. Our Indigenous language centres are critical for all language maintenance and revival activities. They not only act as advocates for languages in their areas, they are a formal body that organises language maintenance activities and through which funding, information and networking flows. These centres are vital to keeping our languages alive, and without them, our languages are in critical danger. It has been very disheartening to see what the funding cuts to language centres has done. Once vital, vibrant organisations are being hollowed out to almost empty shells. We need more language centres, not less. We need to be thinking creatively about how we can make the funding for Indigenous languages, including research funding, work more effectively for our languages on the ground. Cutting funding to the language centres is a cruel blow for our languages and is not the answer.
There's been a few comments about language centres specifically, and as people have been talking about language centres, I do a lot of work with the Healing Foundation, and they talk about healing centres as well. And to me, there's a bit of a synergy between language, revitalisation of language as a key ingredient of healing. And it's interesting to look at cost-benefit analysis issues when you look at the cost of incarceration for one person is about $300,000, I think. So realistically, healing language, if we stop 2 of our people going into incarceration, there's an operational budget. And probably over a 10-year period, you'd actually physically buy the infrastructure that you could own outright. So we just need to think differently. And it's all part of an extension of healing. Thank you. Lesley?
I guess that on that point too, we need to be thinking a bit more creatively about reinvestment from some of these other areas like social justice, health, and so on into Indigenous languages, recognising the healing value of languages for Indigenous people.
I reckon Gillard was a naughty child at school, yeah? He up and down. I'll come to you shortly. Jackie, 2 questions I'll put to you, seeing we did the Jeopardy job in the other room, so I'll put 2 questions to you in the context of your background and research. What are the priorities for first languages, and how do we make academic research relevant to the community and consult with them more effectively?
I'm glad you've asked that. I guess my particular interest as somebody who has got an academic background in linguistics, but I'm also Aboriginal, I'm Ngarigu. And thank you, Yugambeh Mob, for having all of us on this beautiful country of yours. It's wonderful to be here. I did say before I'm glad it's raining or I'd want to be down at the beach. So on this panel we've got 3 people who are trained in linguistics. That's Uncle Stan Grant. Now he's come from if you don't mind me talking about your brilliant piece of work over many decades, Uncle Stan. So the Wiradjuri language is now one of the strongest languages in New South Wales in terms of its community activity and schools activity. Uncle Stan was a pioneer, and his own research work that he did with another person who was a linguist, who wasn't Aboriginal but had drunk the Kool-Aid, and I think probably was in many ways as black as a lot of us. So he'd lived up in the Northern Territory for a long time, this fella. But Uncle Stan and John Rudder were an amazing team, and were funded with money from the what's now the ILA Languages Program, and put together their skill set. Uncle Stan spoke language, knew people who knew language, had grown up with language, but there are all these historical documents. And I had the privilege of, at one point, managing the National Languages Program and supporting Uncle Stan's work. And I saw somebody go from being, I guess, a natural linguist. So in this room there are many, many Aboriginal and I hope Torres Strait Islander as well, people who have done language work and just know what they're doing because they've got a real ear for how things sound. They are really interested in how language works. And as linguists, if we don't have people like that to work with, there's no point trying to do linguistics because you really need that kind of guide. And I saw you, Uncle Stan, grow into a linguist. You may not have that trade certificate I've got, but you might as well. And Lesley's now doing her PhD at the Australian National University, wrote a wonderful research master's degree on the ethics of linguistics and what is our role as Aboriginal people in this area. So what I see is that into the future we need, and I suppose I should tell you, my own interest came from growing up in Sydney, and when I realised in my late teens actually, and then when I got to Sydney University, I was thinking, hard about this because my mother had dragged me off to Mexico. I've got a very strong Aboriginal mother, high country woman, who got her PhD, but she decided to do it in Mexico because she's an artist and she could do it there. And I had to speak Spanish over there. I wasn't going to. I was like most monolingual Australian kids at the time. I was bloody well not speaking Spanish. They were going to have to speak it. That was cured by a very lovely young man called Juan Ignacio after about 2 weeks. So I needed to talk to him, and so I had to learn Spanish. So it was a desire to communicate. Why? And so I came, but I thought, well, where's the language? Where's the Aboriginal language of Sydney? You know, what's going on here? And as I've gotten older, of course, what's happened to my language, Ngarigu, and I there was this terrible sense of loss that we've just heard about, with Bangala Mob, of I can't speak my language. How can I be Aboriginal if I don't speak my language? And of course, when I was growing up, we weren't even given the courtesy of being called Aboriginal in the southeast. We were sort of the coloured folk or half castes or rubbish people if we were lucky. All kinds of dreadful names used because we didn't have we weren't doing the things that mob in Central Australia could still do, that kind of thing. So language to me is something that has to come from community. Our community need to develop the skills